Chapter 5. It's called Yorkshire. The train journey from London to York felt like it would never end. After exploring the long snake of carriages several times, the two cousins eventually squeezed into what might have been the last two available seats. Their position outside one of the train's few toilet cubicles perhaps explained why they had remained unclaimed. At first, the carriages had bustled with noise and movement. Many children sobbed loudly or tried to comfort friends. Yet there were just as many who seemed excited to be leaving London. These laughed cheerfully or leaned out their windows to wave at people in the towns and villages which flew past. One group of boys even sang several songs, encouraging the rest of their carriage to beat an accompanying rhythm on their gas mask boxes. After that first noisy hour, though, the train grew mostly silent. The adult wardens and stewards encouraged this with shouts of "Pipe down!" and "Keep it shut!" whenever chit-chat or laughter threatened to erupt. Sam was thankful for the peace. Lily had already cried herself into a fitful sleep. The gentle rock of the train on its tracks was threatening to turn Sam's own eyelids to lead when a voice pulled him from the brink of slumber. "You know much about this Scarborough place?" Sam rubbed his eyes open and blinked the world into focus. He recognised a younger boy peering down at him in front of the halls of his school. Tom Mahoney was a year younger than him, and quite a lot smaller. "Not really," Sam told him. "Rich folk used to go there on their holidays, I think. Not sure many people do that now. My grandma says that they've got a whopping great fishing fleet up there. Hundreds of trawlers, by all accounts." Tom's blue eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. He ran a small hand through a twist of blonde hair, which looked as though it hadn't seen a comb for days. "I hope one of the fishermen's wives takes me in. I'd love to go out to sea." Sam nodded, though he couldn't think of anything worse. He remembered his dad taking them out onto the Serpentine Lake in a rowing boat before he'd been called up. The small waves caused by other rowers had made him feel ill. The thought of going out onto the rough North Sea was enough to chill his blood. "What kind of family are you hoping for?" Tom asked. Sam shook his head. "Dunno, Tom. I haven't really thought about it. Someone kind, I reckon, with a house big enough to take our Lily too." Tom glanced across at Sam's sleeping cousin. Doubt twitched his nose. "You'll be lucky, Sam. She's not your sister. The bloke on the platform told our mum that the priority is for siblings, and we all have to make sacrifices in wartime. Shame you haven't got the same surname, eh?" "Well, there'll be trouble if they try separating us," Sam warned. "I ain't going nowhere without Lil." The platform at York Station was heaving, and, as the weary children stumbled out of the carriages, space soon became scarce. They all juggled various bags and boxes of different sizes. Some even clutched parcels wrapped in brown paper and string. And it wasn't long before they were all squashed side by side like pencils in a box. Elbows clashed as the older boys jostled for room. Crossed words and raised voices made it obvious that fights and scuffles weren't far away. Sam and Lily had been the first off the train and were pressed into the alcove next to the station's ticket booth. They were nervous and scared, just like the rest of their group, and knew it wouldn't take much to ignite such an incendiary atmosphere. Fortunately, this hadn't gone unnoticed, and the shrill bellow of a tall, thick-limbed woman quickly brought some order. "Quiet!" The entire platform quickly fell silent. "That's quite enough of your racket, thank you very much," she told them. Her tone was as firm and strong as the stride that she took along the platform. "My name is Mrs. Scales." She was wrapped in a brown woolen coat, held tight around her waist by a leather belt. Both looked as though they had once belonged to her husband. In fact, the only nod to feminine fashion was a red headscarf, which seemed to struggle to contain a straining nest of black and grey hair. "You're in Yorkshire now, boys and girls." The thick soles of her boots thumped the platform like blocks of wood as she prowled before the group. "We do stuff differently up here. We do things properly. And we won't stand for no nonsense. Do you understand?" A murmur of uncertainty rustled from one child to the next, as they exchanged whispers and shrugs. Mrs. Scales narrowed her eyes as strong arms folded across her chest. I said, "Do you understand?" The last word was spat loud enough to make several girls whimper. Good. Right, let's get this sorted then, the woman continued. Her weather-reddened cheeks wobbled as she spoke. The easier you lot make this, the quicker you'll be off to your new homes and families, and the sooner I get back to doing proper work on my farm. Mrs. Scales stopped to glance down at the row of children in front of her. Her eyes settled on Tom Mahoney. By heck, lad, I bet that's never seen the back end of a cow. Am I right? I... Tom's lips quivered as he struggled to form words. Stroked a horse once. Mrs. Scales' face cracked into a cruel grin, and she unleashed a bellowing laugh. Tom looked at his feet. Blotches of pink appeared on his pale cheeks. Well, lad, you better get used to some hard work up here. This ain't a holiday. Lily nudged her cousin lightly in the ribs as she whispered, What kind of English is she speaking, Sam? Without taking his eyes off Mrs. Scales, Sam replied, I think it's called Yorkshire, although I suppose she could be Danish. Blimey, Lily gasped. Do they still have Vikings up here? No chance of that, Sam assured her. I reckon women like Mrs. Scales scared that lot off centuries ago. Yorkshire's answer to Boudica was joined by a team of equally no-nonsense helpers, and soon the large flock of confused evacuees was being herded into smaller, more manageable groups. The booming voice of Mrs. Scales controlled everything, managing operations like a conductor directing an orchestra. Bridlington, go to the left. Malton and Pickering, to the right, she instructed as her assistants checked the labels attached to each child. Elmsley, go over to that ticket booth, and I want Scarborough to gather near those metal stairs. There'll be quite a few of you lot going there with me today. That's us, Sam said, double-checking Lily's label. He grabbed her cold hand and began to ease them both through the crowds. Come on, stay close. Some of the other women were holding up cards now, with the names of towns written across them. Sam spotted the one for Scarborough and followed the stream of children who were heading towards it. The labels were checked before they were shoved towards a flight of metal platform stairs. On the opposite tracks, a train much smaller than the one they had arrived on belched smoke up towards the roof. Stay still, the woman with the card ordered. She was younger than Mrs. Scales, much slimmer and prettier too, but her face was wrinkled with stress and her voice was sharp. I need to count you all, and I can't do that unless you stop shuffling around. It seemed that counting was done differently in Yorkshire. In London, people mostly use numbers. Here, the woman counted by slapping each child on the top of their head. Hey! Ouch! That hurt! Eventually, the woman stopped slapping the children and nodded to Mrs. Scales. 108! That's a lot of them. The two women exchanged relieved smiles before the one with the board pointed up the platform steps. All right, you lot, follow Mrs. Scales. The metal steps rang like out-of-tune bells as the group began its climb. There's another train waiting on platform 3 to take you to Scarborough. I don't like this, Lily told Sam as she squeezed his hand tightly. Why is everyone so unfriendly? Don't worry, Lil, Sam tried to comfort her. It'll be different when we get to Scarborough. I'm sure it'll be more organised and nicer. I don't know, Sam. I don't think they like us up here. Feels like they don't really want us. Chapter 6. Hoping for fewer. Unsurprisingly, the train journey from York to Scarborough was much more subdued. Hardly anyone dared to speak, and the overbearing presence of Mrs. Scales kept even the rowdiest boys in check. Sam and Lily spent the majority of the 60-minute journey gazing out across the beautiful rolling countryside. It was mostly farmers' fields and lush green woodland. Harvest time was still a month away, and golden swathes of sun-ripened wheat rippled like water in the breeze. I didn't know that Yorkshire was so pretty, Lily admitted. Shame the people aren't as nice as the scenery. They won't all be like Mrs. Scales, Sam promised. We have people much worse than her in London. I bet we will be staying with the nicest family you can imagine. Lily's eyes lingered on a flock of fluffy sheep munching happily in the field. I suppose anywhere is better than staying with Mrs. Scales. The children never got as far as Scarborough. Instead, their train pulled up at a poky red brick station in a town called Filey. A group of stern-faced locals waited on the platform to greet them. Once the children were hustled into groups and silenced with sharp hisses and hushes, Mrs. Scales stepped towards the oldest of the locals. He was wearing the nicest suit, and the serious expression on his face made Sam think he might be in charge. "How many this time?" the man asked. 108, Mrs. Scales answered. "All of them, then?" The man's sigh did nothing to disguise his obvious disappointment. "I was hoping for fewer." Mrs. Scales gave him a dismissive shrug. "The families will take 'em, Councillor Bentley. Lord knows we all need to extra money into food. The rations Churchill's mob give us are nowhere near enough to see us through to a week. I don't know what they eat down in Westminster, but they shouldn't try feeding a family of hungry farmers." The councillor's tight-lipped scowl suggested they had little patience for the big woman's complaints. "Some of us manage better than others, Belinda. Now, let's get this lot out to town hall before half of the families have second thoughts." Even with the tables and chairs moved into other rooms, the town hall's council chamber was too small to comfortably house 108 children, plus the large gaggle of local mothers. But that didn't stop Mrs. Scales from trying. "Come on," she urged. "I hear London streets are crowded. You lot should be used to squeezing together." Tom Mahoney shuffled close to Sam and Lily. Maybe someone should remind her that half of the population has gone off to war. He glowered across at the large Yorkshire woman. "If my mum was here right now, she would give her what for." "If my mum was here, I'd ask her to take me straight home," Lily added. "Hush at the back," ordered Councillor Bentley. "The sooner we get started, the sooner we get finished. We've a lot of children to find homes for." He checked his watch with a frown. "And it's already later than I'd like." The mood in the crowded room was tense. The two groups faced each other like rival war clans, each eyeing the other with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. Smiles were certainly in short supply. If the children had expected the selection process to be well organised, they were disappointed. It quickly became obvious that the local officials and Mrs. Scales were making things up as they went along. Rather than adopting any carefully thought out or fair procedure, the town's parents were simply being allowed to pick whichever children they wanted. "I'm looking for 2 brothers," one of the women said, as she prowled up and down the front row of children. "Not too young, mind. I want strong arms. I'm not here to model copy anyone." Several pairs of brothers reluctantly raised their arms, and after assessing each one, the woman dragged the largest 2 from the crowd. She signed her name on a piece of paper before being handed 2 small boxes packed with rations, a box for each child. Thankfully, not all of the Yorkshire mums were as mean-spirited. Many seemed to feel generally sorry for the children and wrapped them in warm hugs as they escorted them into their temporary new homes. Some had even the foresight to bring handkerchiefs to dab away tears. 1 or 2 delved into the ration boxes to hand their new charges a chunky bar of chocolate or a packet of biscuits. Soon, only a handful of children remained. Sam and Lily were left among them. "I've only got room for 1, an older woman said, stepping forward. She looked as though she was probably someone's grandmother. "I prefer a girl. I have 2 daughters, so I'm used to looking after girls." Mrs. Scales dragged a timid-looking 6-year-old from the middle of the group. She had to prise a pigtailed girl's fingers from her clutch of her best friend's hand. "No!" the girl ejected. "I want to stay with my friend. Mummy promised." "Mummy's not here, is she?" Mrs. Scales sneered, shoving the youngster towards the old woman. "You better get used to being on your own." The little girl's pitiful sobs and wails could be heard from the street outside as the last few mothers made their selections. Eventually, a young woman with kind brown eyes and carefully arranged sandy curls pointed towards Sam. "I'll take this boy. He's a kind face." Sam felt his throat suddenly tighten as Lily's arms wrapped around his like an octopus tentacle. Clearing his throat with a cough, Sam said, "We're together." Mrs. Scales snatched a list of names and signatures from the desk. "Name?" "Samuel Hunt." And the girl? Lily, Sam replied. Silence hung in the air like a claustrophobic cloud as Mrs. Scales ran her gaze up and down the tatty sheet. Finally, she lifted her eyes and stared triumphantly at the two children. There's no Lily Hunt listed here. My name's Lily Taylor, Lily explained. We're cousins. I only agreed to take the one, Sam's potential host began. But I suppose... Nonsense, Mrs. Ward. Mrs. Scales silenced the smaller woman with a raised hand. Cousins aren't siblings. It's hard enough finding room for brothers and sisters. If we start agreeing to find shared accommodation for every Tom, Dick and Lily, we'll have chaos on our hands. Sam took a deep breath and stepped in front of his cousin. I'm going nowhere without my Lily. He could feel his heart drumming against his chest as he locked icy stares with Mrs. Scales. You can send us both back to London if you want. We'll take our chances with Hitler's bombs. Send you back to London? Mrs. Scales took a heavy step towards him. When she leaned down close, her sour breath made Sam wince. And who do you suppose will fork out for your train fare? Your tight-fisted mothers? They've barely sent enough money to pay for board and lodgings. Before he could react, the large woman reached out and wrapped her strong fingers around Sam's lapel. He felt his feet momentarily leave the ground as he swung away from Lily and propelled towards Mrs. Ward. He had landed in a winded heap at the feet of the sandy-haired woman. A mixture of shock and pain welded him to the spot as Mrs. Scales closed her fingers tightly around Lily's arms. I'll take this one home with me, she gloated, grinning unkindly at Sam. We've got spare room up at the farm and lots of ways to make sure Cousin Lily here earns her keep.